Hello and welcome. Today's video is going to take you on a brief tour of the Lincolnshire Wolds and Coast Churches Festival, which I attended in September 2021. For 2 weekends, various churches open their doors to visitors far and wide. It is a great opportunity to immerse yourself in the splendid architecture and rich history these buildings have to offer. Our first stop takes us into the Lincolnshire Wolds and to the village of Ludford. The Church of St Mary and St Peter was built in 1864, replacing 2 earlier churches. Built from ironstone and limestone, this Grade II listed building is located high in the Lincolnshire Wolds. Let's take a look inside. This is very typical of many village churches. Old wooden pews, majestic stained glass and a ceiling which looks like an upturned boat. I researched this and discovered the ship has strong symbolism in Christianity, for example Noah's Ark. Also, it is usual to see these types of ceiling above the nave. The word nave comes from Latin navis, meaning ship. The village of Ludford has strong connections to the Royal Air Force. In 1943, an RAF station known as RAF Ludford Magna was opened here. Lincolnshire is famously known as Bomber County. This is due to the large number of World War II airfields it had, meaning that many planes, such as the famous Lancaster bombers, often took off from here. Number 101 Squadron were based here from 1943 to 1945. Post-war, many of the RAF buildings were used to house 800 Polish refugees. 1953 to 1963 would see Number 104 Squadron based in Ludford as the threat of the Cold War loomed. It is therefore no surprise to see the church still proudly houses memories of its military history. For our next stop, we're heading towards the coast and to the village of Saltfleetby. The village of Saltfleetby St Peter lies just 3 miles inland on the east coast of England. From the outside, it would be easy to think that this is just another dusty old English church. However, the Church of St Peter has a special history. Upon entering, the first thing which hits you is the modern yet somehow old feel of this place. The reason for this is because this is not the original church. The original church stood about half a mile away. On this stretch of the east coast, the land was once marsh. The original church began to subside, and so the decision was made to dismantle the church stone by stone and to move it further inland to its present location, where it has remained since 1877. So if we look at the present day map, we can see here this is where the church currently stands. Zoom back out and we just go further across, then you can see here is the site of the original church. Now if we go back out again and change to the 1888 map, then you can see the area hasn't changed a great deal. The remains of the original church are already marked on there, so let's head there and see what we can find. Just coming into view now is the old Grade I listed 15th century tower. Just by looking at the brick doorway, you can see why subsidence was a problem, because that is actually the top portion of the door. Here you can see how subsidence has affected the upper portion of the tower. It leans to one side rather dramatically. It wasn't possible to enter the tower as the gate was locked, so I tried filming through the bars. Whilst it isn't the best quality footage, it is enough for us to see that it is now nothing more than a storage space for what appears to be old masonry. You can just make out the interior of the bricked up door that we saw earlier. This was a beautiful, peaceful location, which wasn't officially part of the Open Churches Festival, but we were kindly directed to it by the helpful ladies at the church we saw at the beginning of our Saltfleetby segment. Next, it was time to head further down the coast and to visit the Methodist Church at Sutton-on-Sea. The Methodist Church at Sutton-on-Sea, built in 1910, is one with a devastating story to tell. In June 2012, lightning hit the roof of the church, causing a fire which destroyed much of the interior, not just through fire damage, but also consequent water damage. The Bible on display is one of the few items salvaged afterwards. The music you will now hear was someone playing the organ. One of the features of the Open Churches Festival are the recitals or opportunities for the public to have a go at playing a church organ. So I will briefly leave you to enjoy the music. Our next stop was in the village of Huttoft, just a little further down the coast. This 13th century church was built from greenstone and limestone. The brick repair and restoration is thought to be from the late 19th century. The tower is thought to be Saxon, although there are no dates confirming this. The cross you can see is Grade 2 listed and was restored in the 19th century. Inside you can see this barrel organ, which apparently plays a selection of early hymns. Here are the names of Huttoft residents who were unfortunate victims of World War I and World War II. This is the font, which dates from the 15th century. You've maybe noticed the flat cart behind. This is called a funeral bier and was used to carry coffins. Poet laureate John Betjeman had strong links to the area and even wrote about this church in his poem, A Lincolnshire Church. Here we could take a better look at some of the 19th century brick repair I mentioned earlier. The graveyard felt somewhat forgotten in places, which provides an excellent habitat for wildlife. Many of these gravestones were dated in the 19th and early 20th century. Next, we head to the village of Markby. St Peter's Church in Markby has the honour of being the only church in Lincolnshire with a thatched roof. The church was built from the remains of a 12th century Augustine priory which stood on this site. The present church was built in 1611 and had a tiled roof until 1672, when Warden Richard White replaced it with thatching, taking the tiles as payment. Inside the church is a simple look. The 19th century box pews provide seating and are thought to have been brought here from another church. By studying the grains amongst the straw old thatched roofs, historians and scientists have been able to learn a lot about ancient grains and how they differ to modern day grains. Our final stop of the weekend wasn't planned, and it wasn't for the church, but because we saw these.
Yeah, so this is raw fleece. This what the alpacas on them. You shear them. You'll feel how soft that is. That's how fine it is. Each one of these fibres.
Of course, it would be rude not to stop here and have a picnic lunch, as is tradition. And here are some of my mudlarking finds. And so began the second weekend of the church's festival. Our first stop took us into the Wolds to the village of Bucknell. The village of Bucknell is said to lie at the centre point of the county of Lincolnshire. It is first mentioned in 806 AD in the Saxon charters under the name Bokenhale. It is also mentioned in the Domesday Book as Buckerhale. It is thought the name of the village means hidden place where the goats are. Like many villages in the county, Bucknell has connections to the Royal Air Force, and the church created World War I and World War II displays for the church's festival to reflect this. In December 1916, Bucknell opened a Class II landing ground, which consisted of 2 grass landing strips. A detachment from No. 33 Squadron was based here until June 1919, when the landing ground was closed. Today, there is no evidence of the landing ground ever existing. Let's take a few minutes to enjoy the items which were on display. The roll of honour for the village of Bucknell shows that the village suffered heavy losses during World War I and World War II. The Church of St Margaret's is Grade 2 listed and was built in the 13th century from greenstone and limestone. In 1884, the west chancel of the church was restored by the architect James Fowler, who was involved in the creation of many of Lincolnshire's old buildings. We really enjoyed visiting this church and appreciated the warm welcome of the people there. Next we headed to the hamlet of Thornton. The church in the village of Thornton is dedicated to St Wilfrid. It is Grade 2 listed and dates from the 15th century. In 1890, it underwent restoration by Ewan Christian. Christian was a 19th century architect who had been involved in restoration work of Southwell and Carlisle cathedrals. More famously, he is known for designing the National Portrait Gallery in London. The organ here was originally from Magdalen College, Oxford, and dates from 1740. Our next stop takes us to the village of Holtham-on-Bain. St Benedict's Church in Holtham dates from the 12th century. Although it was declared redundant in the 1970s, it still retains use as a place for village social events and meetings. This Grade 1 listed church, built from greenstone, limestone and red brick, has seen many alterations in its time. The final restoration was in 1891, when seating capacity was raised from 67 to 140. The font dates from the 14th century, while some of the family pews are from the 15th century. To the rear of the church there are boards painted with the coat of arms belonging to King Charles I, along with biblical text. This church is also the only one we came across which had its own chickens. Our penultimate stop leads us to Stickford. The 13th century Grade 2 listed church is not the first church to exist on this site. The Domesday Book tells us that there was an earlier church here. Like many churches, St Helens has undergone restoration several times. In 1863, architect James Fowler, who was involved in the work on many Lincolnshire churches, became involved in the restoration here. This newspaper, dated the 12th of May 1937, was discovered when repairs to the tower roof were being carried out in June 2008. The front page celebrates the coronation of King George VI, which was held in Westminster Abbey. I wonder if this newspaper had been deliberately left there for someone to find in the future. This church had a really interesting selection of gravestone styles, ranging from elaborate monuments to the more traditional headstones with flourishing text. Our final stop took us to East Kirkby. The Church of St Nicholas in East Kirkby was quite literally a hidden gem, located at the end of a hidden lane. Dating mainly from the 14th century with some 13th century features, the church was built using Ancaster stone and greenstone. There is a story that in 1643 Oliver Cromwell's army stabled their horses overnight inside the church before heading to the Battle of Winceby, which is about 5 miles away from East Kirkby. The damage to the ends of the pews is said to have been caused by the horses chewing on the wood. Do you think that this could be true? Or do you think the damage is more likely to be from wear and tear and woodworm? It wasn't just churches we visited over the 2 weekends. We also stopped off in New York. Unlike the more famous New York, there were no bright lights and bustling activities here. If you have enjoyed this video and would like to know more about the Lincolnshire Wolds and Coast Churches Festival, you can visit the website marked at the bottom. The dates for the 2022 festival are at the top right. Coming up in May 2022 is the West Lindsey Churches Festival, which is similar to the Wolds and Coast Festival, but covers a specific area in the county of Lincolnshire. If you have enjoyed this video, then please like, share and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.